Hi, everyone. As always, as you can see with these, we're doing something a little different. I'm thrilled today to be joined by Aubrey Sitterson, who some of you may know from Savage Hearts, No One Left to Fight, G.I. Joe, the comic book story Professional Wrestling, and much more. And he has a new outing coming out very soon, which is Free Planet. And you worked on that with Jed Dougherty, you've done stuff with before, like Savage Hearts. And then we have colors by Vittoria Estone or Estone, I'm not sure. Either way. But
I believe it's a Stone. He is Italian, so I think you
that's
pronounce
what I was
you
going
pronounce
for.
the E. Yeah, and that helps too, I think, if you do it. Sasha, thank you so much for having me. I'm a big fan of yours, the channel. I got turned on to y'all by Tony Fleece, who I know did a fantastic interview with y'all, and I am so glad that he sent me your way, because you have a fantastic channel, and I'm stoked to chit chat with you about it. Thank you for having me.
I appreciate that, and I really appreciate you also sending Free Planet my way. I have it with me, the Ashcan. It's very lovely also. It's very solid, I have to say.
Hell yeah. I love hearing that. Print Ninja in the US, in the US of A, printed that for us. But we did those for Comics Pro for the big,
Mm,
massive annual retailer convention and industry meeting, because, you know, I was going to attend because it's here in LA where I live,
mhm.
but also, Free Planet is I'm sure we'll probably talk about it a little bit, but Free Planet's a very specific type of book, and I don't think PDFs really do it justice. And anybody trying to read it digitally is not going to get the full effect. So it was really important to us that we print up
Mhm.
full, nice, beautiful printing versions of these so that retailers can actually see what they're getting into. And they've since become kind of a collector's item on eBay. Like they're going for like $150
Oh,
on
wow.
eBay. Yeah, so hang on to that thing. That's a solid investment you got there right there, Sasha.
I can definitely agree with the fact that it should be read physically because I've done both. And I remember after I had read the digital one, I was asking you a question about some of the lettering, and you're like, oh, that's just a digital thing. It's not like that in the
Yeah.
physical copy.
Yeah, weird Photoshop artifacts and however we outputted that PDF, unfortunately. Unfortunately, we've since corrected that and the PDF has
That's good.
turned it around.
But when you were constructing it, were you aware that you were creating something that was meant to be more physical than digital?
Absolutely. Absolutely. That was front of mind for us throughout the creation
Mhm,
process and the development of Free Planet. I feel very strongly, there's nothing wrong with digital comics, right?
mhm,
Whether it's, whether you're reading things guided view or, doing the vertically scrolling stuff or web comics,
mhm,
certainly, right? But I think that none of those forms really engage with what's my favorite part of the comic book reading experience, which is the use of the page.
mm,
And, I'm a big Howard Chaykin fan. I met Jed through Howard, who I
mhm,
adore as a person. Um, Jed was assisting him. He's working for him years and years
mhm,
ago. That's how I first met Jed, and both of us really learned a lot from Howard in terms of approaching the page and designing instead of just dividing a page up into panels and then drawing things within them, designing a narrative experience and using page layout as a narrative tool. And, when you do stuff, even with just something as simple as a spread, right, across both
mhm,
panels, it doesn't read digitally. Right. There's
mhm.
no, there's just like there aren't tablets big enough to hold and to fully appreciate the entirety of a spread in one go. And that's what it's about, right? It's not just single images in order, which can be great. There are a lot of really great vertically scrolling web comics out there. But when you're talking
Mhm,
about comic books, what the unique experience that they can provide is very much tied in with turning the page and being overwhelmed and wanting to not just grind through as quickly as you can, but
mhm,
sit down in that world and really absorb it all. Have I
mhm.
told anybody what this book's about yet, Sasha?
We have not gotten to that point, so we should probably break it down and tell
I,
them what it
I got it.
actually is, a brief
I've done a lot
synopsis.
of I've done a lot of practice on this. So before I go any further, it is about Free Planet is about the first completely free planet in human existence. They've just won a brutal revolution against a corporate dominated oligarchy with tendrils stretching out throughout the galaxy. Their home planet is the only place you can find a uniquely potent energy source that has guaranteed their independence, but has also made them a target of multiple galactic empires. The only people defending this planet are these folks, the Freedom Guard. You've
I
gotten that one.
do. I
There they
do.
are, folks, the Freedom Guard. They're revolutionary heroes, each and every one of them. They all fought in the war. They're all deeply committed to the dream of a free planet. But just like everybody in this great nation of ours, Sasha, they all have completely different ideas about what freedom actually entails. And that's the crux of the drama. All of the big explosive military action, all the geopolitical maneuvering,
Mhm.
and of course, because it's a space opera, all of that hot, intense interpersonal drama.
There's definitely a density of this, but it's not a bad kind of
Thank
density.
you. Thank you for qualifying that. Dense is kind of it's kind of like a naughty word in comics. People
It
don't
does
want to.
have a bit of a negative connotation, a bit.
It does. And I'm biased, but I would say it's dense without being turgid, right? Like it's like Dune or something, right? Like
Mhm.
it's dense and there's a lot going on there, but first of all, it's accompanied by the tremendous artwork of Jed Doherty. It's
Mhm.
just outrageous looking stuff. And yeah, look at you. You were on the ball. I'm just endlessly impressed. Yeah, look at this stuff. It's outrageous, right? So yeah, there's a lot of words on the page, but one, it's accompanied by stuff like this, right? So there's plenty to absorb, and it's dense and rich in visual information, based on not just the art, but how the
Mhm.
art is arranged on the page and how the lettering fits in with that. And that's credit to Jed, who does balloon placements as part of his layouts. And that's a
Mhm.
Chaykin thing. That's a Howard Chaykin thing as well, ideating the page in consideration of where all of the typographical elements are going to go, right? And not viewing
Mhm.
these things as totally separate processes.
So how does that work for the collaboration process between you and Jed? Like, how much are you sending him? How much is he just taking and going with it type of thing?
So that's a great question, and it's central to what I think is unique about Free Planet, both for myself as well as broadly. This is get ready for an arrogant claim. There aren't other comics like Free Planet on the market. There just simply aren't. There's not other stuff like this on the shelves. And what is fundamentally different about it, it's touches on what I was just jabbering to you about. It's a change to our process. I had always done thumbnails on kind of an ad hoc basis as a writer,
Mhm.
right? I would write a script and I would say, is this page really going to work? And is there a way that this can work? And I would sort of sketch it out and make sure before I sent it on to the artist and they were stuck solving this terrible storytelling puzzle, right? That I've created for them. And I used it that way and it's helpful. But with Free Planet, I decided that wasn't sufficient, right? Too many of my books certainly have connective tissue. They have
Mhm.
pages that are really just meant to move the story along because they are primarily ideated not as visual art objects, but as narratives.
Mhm.
And that it's just how the industry is structured, due to kind of historical and industry factors, that aren't
Mhm.
worth getting into. But that wasn't enough for me. And I wanted what I was talking about earlier, every time you turn a page,
Mhm.
if you there's this kind of false idea that when you turn the page, your eyes go to the top left or like the top right if you're reading manga. And that's
Mhm.
not true. There have been countless cognition studies and reading studies that show that when you turn a page, your eyes bounce all over the place. They
Mhm.
look at everything. You look at everything all at once, and then you move back and you start reading left to right. And that's what you're consciously doing, but your eye still bounces around, right? And
Mhm.
that's a thing that in comics we can utilize, right? And we utilize
Mhm.
it through, again, this approach to the page. And in order to do that, I didn't want to get caught in situations where I was like, well, yeah, approach to the page and all, but I need to move pieces around for a few pages here in order to like
Mhm.
get my narrative right. So now, and I've done this for Free Planet, and I started doing it on some of my Archie work as well. It's kind of like a
Mhm.
test run. I Prior to writing a script, I'll have an idea of what goes in the issue, but I'll sit down and look. This is a Casually Comics exclusive. I do thumbnails. These are my thumbnails from issue
Oh,
one.
nice.
Yeah, 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 yeah. I'm gonna put them away. I don't want to show too much. But no, those are my thumbnails, and I do that not to control Jed, because here's the thing: I never send them to Jed.
Mm.
He doesn't need them, and he does a better job. He does a better job than me anyways. But what it ensures is that there's never a situation where I'm just saying, "Yep, there's 5 panels on this page. You figure it out." Instead,
Mhm.
I come with ideas. I come with here's how we're going to approach this spread, and how it's going to be laid out that feeds not just into the narrative we're telling, but the thematic exploration that we're doing. And that's, those were my twin goals with Free Planet, were to make something that functions as art object, right? Like a physical thing you have to hold in your hands and you're incentivized to spend time with, and
Mhm.
then literature, such that when you spend time with it, you're rewarded for the level of effort that you're willing to put in with all that density you're talking about, right? So if
Mhm.
people really just want to look at the art and read the dialogue, fair enough, you absolutely can. But if you dig in, if you read those big chunky captions, the intent is that you're provided with rich, intricate world building that, instead of just giving needless background,
Mhm.
contextualizes what you're seeing and maybe even offers up an alternate point of view, or makes you kind of adjust how you're viewing what you're seeing take place in the comic.
Because we were talking earlier before in email about some of your approach to letting the reader engage with it in their own way and form their own meaning from it. So, do you ever have an experience where you feel that people are forming the wrong opinion, or are you completely open to just whatever people
About
get out of
about
it?
Free Planet, or
Yeah,
just things
just
broadly?
in general, in terms of like like whenever you're creating a work, because obviously as the creator, you know whatever the intent or ultimate
Sure.
world map is.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there are for sure times that I think people's read of things is off. Right? And I think that's true. I think that's true of every writer, because you write these things with a specific intent. And, you know, I think that's part and parcel with the approach on Free Planet too, in that, that's a thing that can really frustrate you when what you're doing is direct metaphor, right?
Mhm,
And has a very specific point of view, and or has a very specific point of view it's trying to put out to people, right? And
mhm,
a lot of stories are structured that way, right? They're straightforward narratives, and they're like puzzles to figure out, right? Like what
mhm.
does this stand for, and what does this mean, and what is, like, like that level of interpretation. And there's nothing
Yeah.
wrong with that. But when you're writing material like that, if somebody misses it, right? Like if like my favorite is Jonathan Swift Modest Proposal. Do you know that, like,
No,
the
tell
history of that?
me.
So Jonathan Swift, who did like Gulliver's Travels, right?
Yes.
And he was this famous satirist, and
Mhm,
he wrote A Modest Proposal, which was a suggestion to deal with the booming population in Ireland at the time. And he suggested that the Irish eat their babies. It was this huge, it was this thing, and it was satirical, right? That's not what he
mhm,
believed. It was done to illustrate the callous, crass attitudes of the English towards the Irish at the time, right?
mhm.
That was the point of it, but people didn't get it, and people got very angry at him about it, right? So, like, and that's the risk if you're doing something that has a direct message, is that somebody might miss it. And that's for sure happened to me in the past. I don't think it's gonna be happening on Free Planet, because Free Planet it's not direct metaphor. And if people start trying to figure out what it means, or what the idea is, or like what the
Mhm,
right answer, it's about freedom and nation building and working together and finding a way to build a build something whole out of fractious pieces. And if people start trying to assign like real world
mhm,
analogs and things, they're going to get all twisted up in knots, because it's not about that. It's about
mhm,
these more complex ruminations on those themes, again, like in hopes that the reader, like with Free Planet, my intent is very much that readers do form their own ideas, right? As opposed to discovering the idea that I want them to. So it's a subtle, but I think important distinction in intent and approach from a writer perspective.
No, it definitely does make a difference, and have you noticed that in terms of the reception that people are having
Absolutely.
to it so far?
Absolutely. And it's limited so far, right? It's
Mhm,
folks like yourself, is comic book retailers, it's friends of mine who,
mhm.
my friends and family, we discount. We can't trust their opinions about our work. But as well as pros, like other comic book pros, and novelist Jonathan Lethem gave us a blurb, which I'm still blown away by. Or people are getting it, and I'm a little relieved, because it's a strange thing. It's different, and it's odd, and it's n- it's not paced or presented like other comics. And there were definitely times, it's been a long time coming, we've been working on it for
Mhm.
years now, and there were times when I started to worry that perhaps perhaps this is too big of a swing. Perhaps folks aren't really ready for this. But I feel fortunate because I think it's how different it is and how unique of a project it is. It's turning out to be a strength. People are
Mhm.
picking up on it and they're appreciating something that, it's dense. Like you mentioned earlier that but I'll say this also to mitigate the density. It's you take a long time to read it. You're getting your money's worth because
Mhm.
it's because there's a lot there. There's a lot to take in. And the thing I keep coming back to, which is this
Mhm.
approach to the page, in part, if we want to go broader than that, it is Jed and my insistence on a holistic and all-encompassing piece of art, right? And
Mhm.
this extends to all the research that I've done on my end, all of just the extensive design work that Jed's done. Just,
Mhm.
every ethnicity has its own aesthetic. Every planet or confederations of planets have their own way of getting energy, which impacts how their guns look and how their guns work and how they travel through space. And so it's both design work and research and world building all kind of funneling into this thing that
Mhm.
we've been picking at slowly, for years. But like the thing, I hasten to mention, we got
Mhm.
6 issues done. We have 6 issues of this thing
Nice.
in the can, lettered and colored, ready to go. Because it takes a while, and we wanted to build up a head of steam, and it took us a while to kind of refine this new way of doing things because it's a lot of work.
Mhm.
It's a lot of work for me to do the thumbnails ahead of time and try and like just rack my brain over, okay, how do we do this more visually? How do we make it
Mhm.
more? How do we make it move faster but have more stuff in it, right? How do we make this
Mhm.
more complex and rich? And then Jed asked himself the same question when he's actually doing the layouts and when he's
Mhm.
actually layering in the absurd amounts of detail on the page.
What did you find took the most time to research?
You know, um, the research for this book is interesting because it's not like, I did that comic book story of professional wrestling, and that's
Mhm.
nonfiction, and I did a lot of research for that. But I had to research specific things, and so it was a very different process. It was more. I knew enough about wrestling that I could and did do page breakdowns. I knew what was going to go on. I knew what we were going to cover on every single page, and then it just was a matter of me saying, okay, what are the gaps that I have to fill in? And so, for instance, I
Mhm.
didn't know a whole lot about UK English wrestling, and so I had to do
Mhm.
more research there than I did elsewhere. Right? And so there were gaps in my knowledge, and so, but Free Planet's really different because there aren't, you know, I haven't been studying specific things to then bring in necessarily,
Mhm.
right? It's not like doing a historical fiction piece where you need like the local color, and you need to know what kind of guns people were using and
Mhm.
things like that. The stuff I read was more to inform the general milieu of a revolutionary and post-revolutionary
Mhm.
society trying to carve out a place for itself. So, that the focus has primarily been on revolutions and civil wars of the 20th century, although I did dig back earlier for some like US Revolution. And I read a huge history of Cuba that was really helpful. And
Mhm.
that's another thing I read about Cuba and Venezuela a lot in terms of being single commodity states,
Mhm.
right? And how that affects their presence in the global community. And
Mhm.
so that was a big inspiration and influence on Free Planet, but also kind of broader political theory stuff too, right? Whether it's old Plato and the Republic, or kind of more modern stuff. I read a lot of Murray Bookchin and Noam Chomsky as well, talking about
Mhm.
kind of political philosophy, and that came in play a lot too, just because each of these characters. I don't think I have. Do I have them printed out here? I gathered together a lot of just my stack of stuff I've done because I do a lot
Yeah.
by I do a lot by hand. I have dossiers on on all the characters, all the main characters. I have full dossiers that has like some biographical information about what role they played in the War of Independence that they've just won. But it's really more about their political and religious and philosophical outlooks, inclusive of how they interact with one another. So for each of the
Mhm.
characters, there's a list of all the other characters describing kind of what they agree about as well as what they disagree about. And all of that was informed by, you know, real world political philosophies and movements within revolutionary coalitions, and these kind of real life spats that occurred between these successful revolutionaries.
So you have those kind of real world historical things that you're playing with, not directly, but just in terms more thematically. But I also noticed in how it's laid out, there are also some fantasy elements just in the way of like, some of the mapping and the
Sure.
way some of the pages are laid out. And you have a history with like sword and sorcery and being a fan of that. So did you
Of course.
incorporate some of those tropes as well?
Yeah, Jed, in my previous book was called Savage Hearts, and it was a
Mhm.
sword and sorcery romantic comedy, so a little bit different. Sword and sorcery still, but a little bit different. Just steamy jungle rom-com. But so I knew that Jed had a lot of proficiency with that material, and so it would be foolish to, you know, leave those tools in the drawer. But that being said, things like maps, I love that you view it as a fantasy thing. And because it is, of course, any fantasy novel worth its
You
salt
gotta have it at the
has
front.
of course, right at the front. So you could refer back to it as you're reading it, right? But I'll tell you what else does that a lot. Nonfiction history books.
True.
Like and that Cuba book I was talking about, it had a bunch of pages of maps at the very beginning of it showing political divisions of Cuba and surrounding Caribbean islands at different stages of
Mhm.
history. And I found myself flipping back to those all the time. So yeah, absolutely. We use maps, we use charts and graphs, we do charts and graphs. They're super popular right now, but we use them. Infographics and diagrams, and what we do that is different. And I think, and I'll stand by this. I haven't seen it done is that we work all that stuff into the pages. Typically, when you
Mhm.
see maps or, maps maybe get worked in, but charts and graphs or tables or infographics, that stuff exists as interstitials or back matter. And that's great. It's what we are talking about before, with, a
Mhm.
fantasy novel or something like that. But
All the
we're,
indexes and all
of
that.
course, yeah. I mean, and that's great, but we're working in comics. We've all anybody reading this stuff already has the buy-in that they are not just willing, but excited to
Mhm.
engage with design, right?
Mhm.
Inclusive of image and text. And what are charts and graphs and maps? What are these things if not communication through design, right?
Mhm.
Communication through design consisting of images and text that has textual weight, but is also
Mhm.
used as a graphical element. And that's comics. So we work them into the pages. And this has granted us two things that I think have been really, really valuable. One, I knew going into it, which was that people would be less likely to skip over them.
Mhm.
Because I know for myself, sometimes if I'm reading a comic and there's like a editorial like chart page in the middle of
Yeah.
it, I'm like, I'll come back to that later, and I don't always do it. But so that's the first thing, and then the other thing, and also I just thought it would look cool, and I thought it was like a more efficient way to just get all this information and data and depth into this thing as quickly as possible, and. But the other thing that it gets us that's even more important is the opportunity for thematic interplay
Mhm.
between the graphs and charts or diagrams or whatever and what's going on around it. Can I show you an
Mhm.
example?
Yeah.
I got I got mine.
Yes.
This is a test one and it's all beat to hell because I pick it up and reference it all the time. So this is a page that has not been shown off other places yet.
Ah.
It is pages 8 and 9. And as you can see, it's a big old honking spread, and there's a bunch of graphs down here on
Mhm.
one side. And what's happening here is the Freedom Guard. So the Freedom Guard has shown up on the scene of a guy who's running an artisanal mining operation. He's selling that potent fuel source on the black market, and they're there to stop him. And it feels oppressive, right? Especially from a US perspective. This guy's land. He's lived there for generations. He owns it. How are you going to tell him what he's allowed to do with his land? And that's what they're bickering about here. There's a
Mhm.
firefight, as you can see, and that's all fine and good, and that's a correct read on this. But if you dig into these charts and graphs, one of them is about cereal production and importation and domestic food versus all the food they're importing in.
Mhm.
And the other one is about how much of this fuel source they're exporting out through official means and how much is going out via black market means. And
Mhm.
if you look at those and then you read the captions around it, all of a sudden you might have a very different view on what's going on that spread in light of the absolutely catastrophically dire economic state of this planet.
Mhm.
It's one of my favorite examples to point out, and it happens right in the first issue, so it's not so early. I'm not giving anything
Mhm.
away. But it's one of my favorite things to point out as an example of how we're using this stuff to create depth that's beyond just direct metaphor. That's something worth kind of like chewing over as a reader. And the hope is that as different as all of those characters are and their mindsets and their beliefs on things, that at different points in the series, my hope is that people will agree with each of them.
Do you have a favorite
I
of them?
do. I do. Did I send you issue 2 or just issue
No,
1?
you have not, just issue 1 so
Okay.
far.
So, issue 2 is about my man, my favorite character. He's right there. His name is Jackson Crater. He's from a neighboring planet, a sister planet. It's mostly an
Mhm.
agricultural planet, and he was involved in a failed labor revolution there. And depending on your point of view, inclusive the plural you,
Mhm.
inclusive of our cast, depending on folks' point of view, he's either a valiant, noble freedom fighter,
Mhm.
or a vicious, bloodthirsty terrorist. And when he joins the Freedom Guard in issue 2, it's controversial, and not everybody on the team is happy about it. He's my
Mhm.
favorite character because he is uncompromising, and he is a lot. He's
Mhm.
he is a complex figure, to say the least.
You mentioned that you've been working on this for a while, that it's taken some time to come
Uh-huh.
to fruition. So, has it changed greatly during that time, or has it pretty much stayed the same?
It's become more.
Mhm.
I think that early on, our early conception of Free Planet was it's the same, right? Free Planet
Mhm.
is at its core a military story. It's an elite military unit. It's about overthrowing a oppressive government and setting up your own society. It's a military story with guns and explosions and big
Mhm.
crazy ships and vehicles and all. It does all those things, but what changed is the level of complexity and depth, and that is due to the time we took on it. And these things
Mhm.
are directly related. The time I took doing research, the time that Jed took doing designs and really laboring over, not just things like spaceships, which he spent a lot of time on spaceships, but actual character designs. That
Mhm.
big spread that you were showing off earlier, people have really responded to that. And I see it online. Folks say, oh, wow, I want to know more about that character. What's with the robot, or what's with the
Mhm.
battle suit, or the two women with the same haircut? Like, what are they all
Mhm.
about? And that's a testament to Jed's strengths as a designer, inclusive of character design. And, you know, all of that stuff fed into each other, right? Things
Mhm.
that Jed drew became story and plot and world building elements, and vice versa. In the course of reading things, I would shoot Jed an email and say, you know what? I think I have thoughts on the type of knife that Jackson Crater
Yeah.
should be carrying, right? Stuff like
Mhm.
that. And that type of specificity, whether readers can identify what, and that's a fun thing. See if you can identify what type of knife Jackson Crater uses. Whether people can identify what kind of knife that is and why that's significant and interesting is irrelevant. It's cool if they do. It's a fun Easter egg. But the specificity of it is what the specificity and consistency of it
Mhm.
is what creates this larger world that makes it easier to lose yourself in. And, sort of counterintuitively, the specificity of it allows it to become more general as well, because
Mhm.
people are able to view these characters as real human beings on account of the level of detail, the level of research, and the
Well,
very
because they feel more fleshed out.
that's exactly it. That's exactly it, And so like that's what changed about Free Planet is how fleshed out it became, all of the heavy lifting on the philosophical and anthropological and political and military fronts, right? Because it's
Mhm.
about all of these things. It's about building a new world, and those are all components of that. And that depth is what was new and what
Mhm.
changed.
Was it hard to find a home for it, like, to get a place to get it published, or was it fairly easy to shop it around?
I have always wanted an image book, An image book has
Mhm.
always been the end game for me, and I've done work everywhere. And image to me was the brass ring. It's the apex because the level of freedom that they provide creators to do their story how they want to do it without editorial interference, without anybody deciding how the book was going to be positioned or marketed or what format it was going to come out in. And image has always been the goal for me, and Free Planet was designed to be an image. It was designed to be an ongoing. It
Mhm.
wasn't designed to be a series of limiteds or minis,
Mhm.
like that maybe don't get followed up on. It was meant to be an ongoing, and an ongoing image series. I think there's a proud tradition of ongoing image series that I aspire to be. I see some of them back on your shelves
Yeah.
back there, right? And I aspire to be part of that tradition. So, in terms of um, getting it approved, I've known Robert Kirkman for about, oh man, ages, since I worked at
Mhm.
Marvel, and I sent it to him. I sent him to ask him. I was like, I want to send this to Stevenson. Eric Stevenson is the publisher of Image.
Mhm.
What advice do you have? Like how, and I'd written a pitch and everything, and like the
Yeah.
present, like I developed my pitch packet, and it was the first six pages,
Mhm.
what have been out as previews. That's what we pitched it with, and the cover. And I did, with the design, because the design was a big part of it too. Mark Kaufman is our
Mhm.
designer, and we had this whole visual presentation we wanted to do, and I sent it to Robert, and without telling me, he just texted it to Stevenson, and Stevenson looked at the art, looked at Jed's art, and I think he was just sold then, right? Like
Mhm.
I think it was a done deal. But he emailed me and said, "Do you have like document like outlines or like ideas about where this is going?"
Yeah.
I was like, "Brother, you don't even know." And so I sent him like kind of like a very very high level right outline of where the kind of
Mhm.
like where the first 12 would end up, and then where it would go from beyond there, and we were
Mhm.
off to the races. But I think it was Jed's art that really sold it, because it's phenomenal. There's nothing else like it. And again, it's because of the level of work that you put into
Mhm.
it, the level of thought into the page layouts, but then also the level um, of like the obscene attention to detail in terms of the draftsmanship on the actual page, like within the panels too.
Mhm. You've done editorial work, right? Have you done
Correct.
editing?
Correct.
Has
I
that
started.
has that impacted how your
Yeah.
writing process has evolved?
I think so. I started my career at Marvel Comics. I was an editor there, and like right out of college, very young. And I did that specifically because I wanted to learn how to write comics.
Mm.
That was the goal. And, you know, there was no social media at the time, and
Yeah.
there weren't there were forums and stuff, and you could maybe find like an Alan Moore script somewhere, but like I don't know, like how helpful is that, right? like so, you know, I started editing at Marvel specifically to learn because I didn't know anything. I knew I
Mhm.
liked comics, I knew I wanted to write comics, but it was strictly from a fan perspective, and I didn't even really understand what an inker did, right? I knew an inker
Mhm.
inked the pages, but I didn't really know what role that served. And I worked at Marvel for 3 years, and I learned an immense amount. I worked for Tom Brevoort, and I worked for Axel Alonso, right? And
Mhm.
I worked on big books, Civil War and Old Man Logan, and I worked with Robert on Irredeemable Ant-Man. That was
Mhm.
where I became buddies with Robert. But what it taught me was the ability to have opinions about all of it,
Mm.
and I do. And I am a relentless. I people compliment my work and say, "Oh, you always get the best artists. And your art, the art on your books always looks so good." And I'm torn because on the one hand, I feel like that's a little bit of a backhanded compliment. Uh, but also they're right, and it's because I'm super picky. I'm extremely picky about the artists I work with and the type of stuff they're doing on the page, and especially with coloring and lettering. And it's
Mhm.
why I've been working with Taylor Esposito as a letterer for forever, like just for
Mhm.
years. And Vittorio Estone is somebody I have not worked with previously prior to the Free Planet, but bought in. He bought into what we're doing. Like he gets it, and he understands and appreciates that, this isn't it's not assembly line comics,
Mhm.
and that's what I this isn't a knock on Marvel. It's just the nature of doing serialized unending comics for a publicly owned company where you need just consistent sales and increasing profits month over
Mhm.
month, year over year, forever, right? And that's just so the nature of these things. They have to be done very, very quickly, right? Everything has to
Mhm.
get done in a month, or you're bringing in a fill-in artist, and then that gets done even more quickly because they don't have the lead time, and it's a mess. And I learned how to do comics like that, and then it took me many years to unlearn how to do comics like that.
Mhm.
But without forgetting the immense amount that I learned in terms of, when you're an editor, you're a traffic cop, making sure things get in on
Yeah.
time, but you're also quality control. You're making sure that every step of it is good. And so I had to learn how to not only give story notes, but to give notes on layouts and give notes on inking. I had to learn what good inking was so that I could critique it. Same thing with
Mhm.
coloring and lettering. And, you know, that's what I've brought to Free Planet, which I guess is to say being a relentless micromanager of my collaborators. I was talking to Jonathan Lethem, who gave us this a great blurb for the book. And
Mhm.
I was telling him just this, and I was kind of lamenting. I was like, man, I'm worried that Taylor and Vittorio are just going to quit on us just because I'm such a bear, right? Because it's, but because we have ideas and we have thematic things that we want to express through the coloring and lettering, and we want them to be part of this holistic visual experience,
Mhm.
right? And if that's what you're doing, you can't just get by on a
Mhm.
assembly line approach. And I was telling them, I was like, I'm worried that Vittorio and Taylor are going to quit on me because I'm such a micromanager. And he said, no, he stopped me. He said, no, 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 you're an auteur. Yeah, I said, yeah, that sounds much better. Let's go with that. That's a lot better than micromanager.
No, I'm so glad you brought up lettering because it makes such a huge difference. I really feel it's one of the unsung parts
Okay.
of comics a lot. Actually, this is one of my favorite pages from it. Can I make myself
Oh,
solo too?
I
Yes,
hope
I can.
I'm going to tell him Taylor needs to watch this because I drove
Yeah.
him nuts with that one. I drove
Well,
him
because
absolutely nuts trying to figure out how, because we had an
mhm,
idea, but we didn't know how it was
yeah.
actually going to play out on the page.
This was also the one where I realized that it really would read a lot better physically than digitally, just because of the way this page is laid out. When you see it on the digital format, it just kind of draws your eye to a place where I don't think it's supposed to be drawn to, which
Yeah.
was really fascinating because, like you said, like the eye can go multiple different places when you're looking at the work, and everybody's just going to go a different place based on the way like their brains are laid out, but there is still a kind of sort of order that needs to work.
Of course. Yeah. Yeah. Your eye goes all over the place and it takes it in as a whole. But then when it comes time to read it, of course, there needs to be,
Mhm.
an eye line. And, I think in a very real way, like if you are even on screens that are big enough to do like both pages side by side, the act of
Mhm.
reading it through an illuminated screen with a toolbar on the bottom and then like a dock on the left and like all this stuff, like it changes the experience of going
Well,
through.
also people are gonna have different color settings and all kinds of things, so it's
Totally.
actually gonna look vastly different depending upon where
100%.
you're reading it. Like, I have 2 monitors right now, and they have different settings because 'cause they're not the same type, but that's fine.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a great point. I think that years ago, I know Nathan Fairbairn, I remember he did, and other people did it too. He's a colorist, he's a great
Mhm.
colorist, and he would deliver two different versions of files to
Mhm.
printers on books. One would be in CMYK for print,
Mhm.
and then one would be in RGB
Mhm.
for illuminated screens. And the reason he did that is because illuminated screens are capable of displaying different colors than
Mhm.
reflected color on the print page. And you can spot I can spot because I'm a crazy person, but I can spot when colorists have worked in RGB. They're typically folks who kind of learned from like DIY type stuff, which I respect and it's great. But they're folks who learn to color for the screen, and they
Mhm.
learned that, oh wow, we can get these really just intense vibrant greens. Why hasn't anybody used this green? It's amazing. And the reason
Mhm.
people don't use it is because it doesn't print. It just it doesn't show up the same way it does on the page. Ditto kind of gradations, kind of
Mhm.
more muddy and kind of there are a lot of different colors than RGB. When you convert them, when you automatically convert them to CMYK, they have higher levels of K tones, which is the black,
Mhm.
and ends up that's how you end up with muddy pages. If you ever open up a comic and just say, "Wow, this feels muddy to me," I can't even really articulate why. That's usually it, because they colored in RGB instead.
No, people don't realize what an intense process it is. I used to work, for a fashion magazine,
Mhm.
and that was one of the jobs, was just somebody had to hold up the physical, like, fabrics, and then somebody had to match them onto
That's
the
amazing.
computer. You would just sit there,
Did you have, like, your Pantone,
and then you would
color
just, like,
schedule?
you would just flip through it and be like, "I think we're
Amazing.
there."
That's
So
so good. Yeah. No, it's interesting stuff. I mean, and, like, and color was when I was at Marvel as an editor, color was one of my favorite things to learn about.
Mhm,
And because at the time there were there was really this ongoing revolution in coloring, right? Because
mhm,
this school of colorists, it was Laura Martin and people who Laura Martin trained and worked with Laura Martin at CrossGen, right? And so when
mhm,
CrossGen shuttered, Marvel snatched up all those colorists, right? So Laura Martin and Frankie D'Armata and Christina Strain, Maury Hollowell, tons of them, right? Will Quintana, I think, was one of them too. Um, like a who's who of great colorists in the 2000s, right? Everybody. And they had really perfected and learned to use these digital tools in new,
mhm,
exciting ways. And everybody else was taking note and doing the same thing. And it was really exciting to talk to colorists at that time because they were figuring out new stuff and new approaches to rendering that were possible
mhm.
given the updates in like maybe Photoshop technology, as well as the better printing quality and paper that places were using as well.
What do you feel like are some of the exciting changes that are happening right now in terms of, like, the comic digital space?
The comics digital space, I'm not really sure. My primary focus is on print comics, and
Mhm,
it kind of always has been. And
mhm,
I'll I have nothing against digital comics, but for me, it's so rooted in the experience of reading the physical object.
mhm,
I think there's always interesting stuff in terms of people kind of adjusting their process in light of the tools available, right? Something that
mhm,
um, Jed, if you ever see Jed at a con
mhm,
my co-creator on Free Planet, if you see him at a convention, go up and check out his originals because he cobbles them together after the fact.
mm,
He does like he'll do a full spread, but then he doesn't like that panel or he wants to redo this section. So he
mhm,
just has other stuff. He just draws it separately and then puts it back in Photoshop later. And then also in addition to that, like he does tones and textures and stuff on the board in ink, but he also does an extensive amount of Photoshop based work on the pages after the fact. So like the what we think of when you look at the work and you think, oh, you have an idea of what the inks look like. It's not what they look like, right? It's like
mhm,
that's always really exciting to me. I saw a thing the other day. I saw Javier Rodriguez, who I think is one of the most exciting artists working in comic right now.
mhm,
I saw he was posting about how he's been working digitally for years, and it makes it easier for him because he can. And I think it's similar to what we've been talking about in terms of Free Planet. It's ways to make this process to escape from the discrete separation of roles, right? Because
mhm,
like for instance, if you're a comic book writer, you should not be doing thumbnails. You have another script to write. You should be working ahead on these things and get them to the artist as quickly as possible so you can get paid and just on to the next one.
mhm,
And likewise, if you're a penciler or inker, you do that. You do that as quickly as possible. Don't worry about color. We have another guy who can do that, and he'll do that. He'll do it real quick, and we'll just be on to the next thing. But Javier colors his own stuff and he does it as a single process. I saw him did an Instagram post about it. And that to me is what's most exciting is people finding ways to kind of break out of the common received wisdom of how these things are supposed to be put together and
mhm,
find new ways that enable us to present something that's an art object, to present something that like that Absolute Martian Manhunter, which I thought was just
mhm,
magnificent, that feels bespoke. It doesn't feel
mhm,
like just a templated thing that they shoved the different talent and their contributions into. It feels like a piece of art. It feels like something
mhm,
that, the driving motivators behind it, which I imagine are Dennis and Javier, probably some level of editorial involvement too, I'm sure. But it's clearly an expression of something that they wanted to explore and that they wanted to do. And, you know,
Mhm.
any kind of technological advancement that better prepares people and better equips people to do that, I think is exciting.
Do you feel like we're in a time right now where people are starting to get more back into comics as their own actual medium and really playing with them in that sense?
Are you talking about creators or readers?
I'd say both because
Okay.
I think they're both there's an interplay between the 2.
Yeah. Yeah, of course. I think that, that stuff, it's been a long time. I think, the dominant approach in US comics for about the past 20 years has been a very like tele and screenplay informed approach to
Mhm,
the medium, right? And I think that, all of these things run their course, right? Like the 90s style of, image, like 90s style of like big explosive image, people call it image, but Marvel and DC did it
mhm,
too, right? Like that type of storytelling and its course. And then people were excited for the next thing because it's just, they just had enough. And then, it comes back in fashion again. So this
mhm.
isn't about, it's not a let's
It's
not
not
make
a better than anything, it's
no,
just it
exactly, that's what I'm
right.
saying. Let's not make a teleological error. Let's not assume all these things are evolving to perfect comics because it's just back and forth all the time, right? But I do think I have observed, and I think it's exciting that people are I think that that approach, that teleplay and screenplay informed approach has kind of run its course. And people are for sure exploring different ways of doing this stuff. And I think that, comics almost since its inception has been on its back foot in as a medium, right? In terms of
Mhm,
trying to define itself and what space it can occupy. Because it was almost immediate comics as a medium in the US was almost immediately supplanted by film, by people
mhm.
being able to go see movies. And so comics has always had to figure out the thing that it can do that nobody else can. And for many, many, many years, and there have been different phases, right? Because for a while in the pre-comics code, it was the fact that they could show like
All
men.
kinds of
Yeah,
violence and all
yeah.
kinds lots
I
they
was
went
gonna say
hard.
I was gonna say syringes going directly into eyeballs, right? Like, like you could just show stuff like that, and that was a strength that nobody else could take advantage of. But, for many years, for generations, it was 2 things. It was, you know, limited special effects budget, right? Like, you
Mhm.
don't have to get a special effect budget to have, like, a giant battle scene. You just need to ruin an artist's weekend by having them draw it. That's all you need to do, right? Uh, that was one, and then the other one was continuity, right? The
Mhm,
fact that and like outside of soap operas and professional wrestling, comics were the only place that you could go and just dip your toe in and enjoy as much as you wanted of this decade-long narrative, right?
mhm.
Interlocking, complex, and you could dig in as much as you wanted, and that was a big appeal. And now in 2025, we've had like how many like 15, 17 years of the Marvel Cinematic Universe doing exactly that, right? Doing
Mhm.
exactly those 2 things. Just big explosive CG stuff and really complicated movie to
Yes.
movie and TV show to TV show continuity. And so like people can get those itches scratched elsewhere. So I think it's normal for, you know, people who love comics to say, okay, like as I do, and
Mhm,
as I did on Free Planet to say, okay, well, what can we do that's different? How do we make, and that's the question, you know, on the journey to being literature and art object, right? Because this is something
mhm,
that only comics can perform. Because the nature of comics, only comics can be literature and art object. A movie can't be literature, right? A
mhm,
novel can't be an art object, right? It's text. It's not formatted that way. It's not ideated and designed in that way.
mhm.
Only comics can do that. And how the question became, how do we fill this thing with things that only comics can do? And for me, the answer is using the page, using layout, and which is why it doesn't lend itself to digital reading at all.
It's one of the things that I enjoyed about it is the fact that it is I'm trying to find the correct word because I don't want to phrase this in a way that sounds negative because it's not negative. Was that it's taking itself seriously and it's not afraid to present itself in that way. Because having read through many, many comics, sometimes it can feel as though there's a fear of coming across as too, too much, too dense, too highbrow, too any of those things. And I think it's a real shame because comics can thrive in all of those spaces in terms of providing something that's more intellectual, that's a bit more literary, and also in terms of being something that can be more kid friendly or more fun. That's one of its strengths, that it can go across so many levels.
100%. And it really, far from offending me. I'm delighted that you said that because, if folks are listening and they've read my previous work, or if they're like Googling while they've got this on and are looking, Free Planet's a big departure. Free Planet is a huge departure from my previous work. My previous work was, a sword and sorcery romantic comedy, or like a big, very emotional Dragon Ball Z soap opera melodrama, right? Like these kind of things. It, I adore them, and I think they were artfully done and they were holistically considered, and I was deliberate in all the choices I made, as I know all my co-creators and collaborators were, but they were not taken seriously. They leaned into the outre and the humor, the humorous, and because I
Mhm.
think comics, you said it just a moment ago, comics are so good at being funny. They're called comics, right? The funny
Mhm.
pages, right? Like I think it's a huge strength of comics. But there's a saying, it's a professional wrestling saying. I think it's true in comics too. Funny ain't money. Funny ain't money, right? You're not going to be a main eventer if you're a comedy wrestler. It's just not going to happen. People need to take you seriously. And I realized that the kind of work that I was doing wasn't allowing people to take me and my co-creator seriously. And so it was a conscious choice. There are no jokes.
Mhm.
There's funny stuff, but it always comes from Jed's drawings. Jed will draw things that look funny, and they're like
Mhm.
characters will have humorous reactions, but it's not set up as a joke, right? And that's unusual for me. Normally, I came to comics originally through comic strips.
Mhm.
That was my gateway drug. And in all my other books, even if it's not a 3-panel page, I write
Mhm.
3-panel comics gags into my
Mhm.
page, because I love that format and I think it's really effective. But you know, Free Planet was a conscious effort to move away from that kind of perception, and to do something, as you said, that's richer and more complex and a little bit more intellectual, and hopefully challenging to people in such a way that they return to it. And that's my hope, and that's
Mhm.
why, you know, it's a benefit from us working so far in advance as well, that we could really layer in thematic richness, right? Whether it's through repeated layouts or it's elements like maps, or I'm going to show you another. Do you want another? Do you want
Of
another
course.
Casually Comics exclusive, never before seen on the internet? So in issue 3, uh, a new a new figure comes to the
Mhm.
Aegis, which is the satellite that the Freedom Guard lives and operates out of, and his name is Ambassador Ural Ken. He's an alien, and we wanted him to be totally alien, right? So we didn't want to
Mhm.
do like Star Trek style humans with green skin, right, or like
Yes.
pointy ears, right? We want him to be actually alien, and so as you can see, tentacles, no face or mouth or eyes, which is really interesting and cool from a conceptual perspective. But from a comics perspective, it's very difficult, because how does this character emote? And he
Mhm.
needs to, right? Because there's no voice, there's no sound, there's no
Mhm.
motion. We need to have a way to show him emoting, right? This is the reason why Spider-Man's eye holes always change shape,
Yeah.
right? Because you need to know what he's thinking, right? Or otherwise it just doesn't land. And so what we did is Ambassador Ural Ken, he's a mood ring.
He's
So
color coded.
he's color coded, right? And it's tied to emotions, but the emotions aren't things like happy, sad, angry, right? Whatever they are, because
Mhm.
he's a complex alien figure. They're things like resigned and obedient, serene and detached, and those are keyed to the color of his head, which is
Mhm.
also keyed to his balloons. So remember, I told you I drove our letterer
Yeah.
Taylor nuts. It's also keyed to his balloons. So whenever
Mhm.
he's thinking a specific thing, his balloons look that color as well. And you know he displays different emotions with different amounts of frequency, and there's one that's quite rare and it doesn't show up ever, and then at the end of an issue he's having a conversation with another character, and the issue ends with his head that color. And
Mhm.
if you remember, I'm very, if you remember what all the colors mean, I'm very impressed. But hopefully, what people will do is they'll go back and they'll check out this key and they'll learn, oh, he's confused and excited. And
Mhm.
the intent is that that will color your perception of that scene and it'll grant new understanding of what's going on in that scene. So, it's a book designed for people to flip back and forth. And, it's not meant to slide it into your Mylar bags and file it away, never to be touched again. You
Mhm.
just have this thing out because you want to reference it. You want to look back through this
Mhm.
stuff. That's how it's designed.
Because it also has the little essay excerpt at
Mhm.
the end as well, which I really enjoyed because I love stuff like that where there's
I'm
just all
glad.
kinds of extra,
Back
information
matter.
about the
Every
world.
issue
Exactly.
every issue is gonna have some back matter, and every issue will have brand new painted illustrations, 2 of them, by Jed. Every issue
Mhm.
is gonna have that, and they're done already. And, they function very similar to, so that one, the one you just pointed to, is about
Mm.
my favorite character, Jackson Crater, and if you read that back matter, it will potentially change a reader's perception of the character in consideration of what they see in issue 2, right?
Mhm.
Because it's added background and you understand where this person came from and why he's behaving in the way that he is. And every issue's got that, and it always serves to either further blow out something for the previous issue or set the stage for something else coming up next. It's not just random stuff. It's not just like world building fluff. It has
Mhm.
actual import to, not, and this was the trick, and this is the trick with all of the captions too. It doesn't have specific narrative import necessarily, but it has thematic and
Mhm.
um perceptual import, right?
Mhm.
It grants you you can, as I said before, you can read the whole book just looking at the pictures and reading the dialogue, and it'll be a compelling military soap opera. But if you want the anthropological and the political and the philosophical and the religious and all of this stuff, the
Mhm.
military, if you want all of that specificity, you dig into the captions and you get rewarded for it. And then the same
Mhm.
true that same is true of the back matter.
Yeah, because for the first one, for the first issue, it really started to build up some of the political landscape and also explain some of the reactions that some of the military higher ups have to the rebellion when you see that going on in one of the flashbacks. It's like, ah, I see, because then you
I love
have all
hearing
those
that.
extra layers.
And that's the intent, it's meant to be a thing that you can kind of dig at and discover new things the more you look at it. That's the hope.
Hmm. I definitely think it has a lot of reread value, and I think that people are going to be excited when they get their hands on it. So how can they do that?
Oh, easy. Call your local comic book shop. If you don't have a local comic book shop, I feel bad for you. That's very sad. You should go to comicshoplocator.com, find your local comic shop, and give them a ring and subscribe to the book. This is important for a couple of reasons. It's going to ensure that you get a copy because, as we're talking about, there's demand for the cans already. So I think uh, this is going to sell out. I'm calling it
Mhm.
right now. It's going to sell out. It's going to be hard to find because I think people are underestimating what this is and how different it is and what the appetite for it will be. And the other really important reason to call your local comic shop ahead of time is that they buy all this stuff non-returnable. It's very difficult for them to plot out how they're going to spend their available capital each month. And if you call and you commit to subscribing to a thing, if you say, listen, I'm going to subscribe to the first 6 issues, that makes it easier for them to plan out their business and stock some other stuff that they might not have otherwise. So yeah, let your comic book shop know before April 14th, and it'll be waiting for you on the on sale day of May 7th. If you don't have a comic book shop anywhere near you, go to comicsandcards.net. That's my local shop. They'll ship it to you. They'll
Nice.
sell you all they'll sell you the first 6, and you'll get them signed by me for free as a bonus, and they'll
Nice.
ship them right to you.
Well, thank you so much for
Thank
taking
you.
some time
Of
to
course.
discuss all of this. I really appreciate it.
This is a blast. Thank you. And I'm sorry if I got a little too excited. As you can tell, I am very stoked about Free Planet, and I can't this working on it for years, and I cannot wait for people to get it in their hands. And I am so honored that you took the time to give such deliberate thought and to be an engaged reader of Free Planet. And it's a different type of book, and I've definitely received some skepticism from fellow pros, and I'm not going to name any names, but I think comics readers are smarter than we give them credit for. I think that there is an appetite for challenging, rich, literary comics, and it is my hope that Free Planet scratches that itch for people.
I 100% agree that people are yearning for that and that they appreciate it. I know that I sure do. And I also appreciate your time. So thank you very much.
Of course, it's my pleasure.
Thanks, as always, to everyone who made it to the end. And thanks to Aubrey for taking some time to sit and chat Free Planet. I'll have all the links down below. I apologize for some of the Alvin auditory cameos. Let me know if you're going to be checking this one out. And as always, there'll be more videos coming soon. I'll see you there. Bye-bye.